Sometimes I think being a parent is like, what do they say? Knowledge is power, right?
Hmm.
Especially when it comes to those early years when our kids are developing so fast.
Absolutely. Early intervention can be a game changer, especially if we're talking about potential developmental challenges.
And that's exactly why I'm so glad we're diving into this article today. It's all about the early signs a child might benefit from ABA therapy.
Right. And this is a pretty timely one, too. It's from September 2024, so it's got the latest research and insights.
Hot off the press. What really struck me was how much it emphasizes early detection.
It makes sense, though, right?
Hmm.
The earlier you can identify any potential areas where a child might need a little extra support, the better the outcomes tend to be.
Totally. It's like, why wait until a problem becomes really obvious when you can address those little things early on? So let's get into some of these early signs. One that jumped out at me was about language development.
Mhm.
The article mentions like a lack of babbling by 12 months or echolalia. I have to be honest, I'm not an expert, so some of those things seem, I don't know, a little subtle maybe. Like, how would a parent even know if that's a sign of a potential issue versus, their kids just taking their sweet time learning to talk?
Oh, you're totally right. Every child develops at their own pace. And babbling, for instance, it's not just adorable baby noises. Well, it is that, but it's also laying the groundwork for speech and language skills. So if a child isn't babbling as much as expected by a certain age, it could mean those foundational skills aren't quite where they should be.
So it's almost like they're missing out on essential practice.
Exactly. And that's where early intervention, like ABA therapy, can really shine.
Hmm.
Because through play-based activities, things kids love, they can work on those building blocks of language in a way that's fun and engaging.
So it's not about forcing it. It's about creating those opportunities for natural learning and growth.
Precisely. And the article even mentioned a case study where a child who wasn't using many words on their own was able to learn several new words and even start putting together short sentences after just a few months of ABA therapy that was tailored to their needs.
Wow, that's amazing to hear. Okay, so we talked about language, but the article also delves into nonverbal communication. And I have to say, as a parent, sometimes that feels like a whole other language I'm trying to decipher. Like, how do you know when something is a red flag versus just, typical kid stuff?
Right, because kids are all over the place, aren't they?
Exactly. So, for example, the article talks about limited eye contact as a potential sign. But, I mean, aren't some kids just a little shyer than others? How do you tell the difference?
You're hitting on a really important point, and it's all about context.
Mhm.
It's not about the occasional shy glance. It's about the consistency and severity across different situations. Let me give you an example. If a child rarely, if ever, makes eye contact, even with their primary caregivers, or if they consistently withdraw from social interaction, even when someone's trying to engage with them in a positive way, those could be signs that something deeper is going on.
So it's like it's not just about the behavior itself, but the bigger picture of how they're interacting with the world around them.
Exactly. And this is one of the many areas where ABA therapists can be so helpful because they're trained to look for these subtle cues and patterns. They can help determine whether a child's behavior falls within the typical range of development or if it suggests a need for additional support.
It's like they have that expert eye to see things that we might not even pick up on as parents.
That's a great way to put it. And what's so amazing about ABA is that it can teach kids those nuanced social skills that many of us take for granted. Things like, reading facial expressions, understanding body language, engaging in back and forth conversation. Those are skills that can make such a big difference in a child's life.
It's like giving them the tools to navigate those social situations that might otherwise feel really overwhelming, especially for a child who's already a little bit unsure.
Right. And the article also touched on social interaction more broadly. Like, it mentioned a child who struggled with taking turns during games or seemed to have very little interest in playing with other children at all.
Yeah, those are definitely things I've seen in my own kids from time to time. Is that something parents should be concerned about, or is it just part of a child's personality?
It's a great question. While it's true that some children are naturally more introverted, struggling with those core social interactions, like taking turns, sharing, understanding boundaries, those can be early indicators that a little extra support might be beneficial.
Okay, so it's about looking for those patterns and trusting your gut if something feels off.
Exactly. And the good news is that ABA therapy often incorporates play-based techniques, which can be so effective for younger children because they're learning these essential social skills in a way that feels natural and fun.
It's like sneaking in those life lessons while they're busy having a blast. Now, the article also delved into some behaviors that, while maybe not directly related to communication, can still be early indicators. We're talking about repetitive behaviors.
Right. And these can sometimes be misinterpreted, so it's important to understand what's going on.
That's what I was thinking. So, like, what's the deal with those behaviors and how can ABA help? The article lists things like flapping their hands, rocking back and forth, or even like needing to follow the exact same routine every single day. And I get it, as a parent, those things can definitely stand out. But should we always be worried if we see those kinds of behaviors?
That's such a good question. And honestly, it's crucial to remember that for a child, those repetitive behaviors, they often serve a real purpose for them in that moment.
Really?
Yeah. It might be their way of like self-soothing when they're feeling overwhelmed, or maybe they're dealing with sensory overload, or sometimes it's even their way of trying to communicate something when they don't have the words. It's like they're saying, hey, something's not right here, but they don't know how else to express it.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it that way. So how does ABA approach those behaviors then? Is the goal to like make them stop doing those things altogether?
Not necessarily, no. With ABA, it's more about understanding, like, what's the why behind the behavior? What purpose is it serving for that child? And once we understand that, then we can start to teach them other ways to get those needs met, ways that are more, functional for them in the long run.
Okay, so it's not about just suppressing the behavior, but figuring out the root of it and then finding those healthier replacements that can help them better cope.
Exactly. I think the article had a good example about this. They talked about a child who would flap their hands a lot, especially when they were feeling anxious. And through ABA therapy, they were actually able to learn some simple breathing exercises and other calming techniques.
Hmm.
And those tools helped them manage their anxiety in a way that was more, socially appropriate, but also, more importantly, it gave them a sense of control over those feelings.
That's incredible. It's like giving them those coping mechanisms that they might not have developed on their own. Okay, so we've talked about repetitive behaviors, but what about sensory processing issues? The article mentioned that too, like how some kids are super sensitive to certain sounds or textures, while others might be undersensitive. Can you kind of paint a picture of what that might actually look like in like a real life scenario?
Sure. Imagine a child who they just can't handle the noise level in like a busy classroom. It's just completely overwhelming for them. Or a child who's terrified of certain textures, like even just the feeling of grass on their skin. And then on the other hand, you have kids who are like almost oblivious to pain or who crave really intense sensory input, like they need to be constantly moving or touching things. It's a pretty wide spectrum.
Yeah, it sounds like it can manifest in such different ways depending on the child.
Absolutely. And so the approach, it has to be tailored to those individual differences.
Hmm.
One of the techniques that ABA therapists use is called systematic desensitization. And it's basically about making those sensory experiences more manageable for the child. Like instead of throwing them into a situation that's just going to completely overwhelm them, you break it down into tiny manageable steps.
So, for example, if you had a child who is really overwhelmed by noise, you might start with like really quiet sounds and then gradually over time increase the volume.
Exactly. It's all about building up their tolerance at a pace that feels safe and comfortable for them. And this is where having that guidance from a trained ABA therapist is so crucial because they know how to identify those sensory triggers and then develop a customized plan to help the child gradually desensitize to those things that are bothering them.
Okay, this is where I think having that expert guidance is so key because it's not about like throwing a child into a sensory overload situation and just hoping for the best. It's about those careful, gradual steps that are tailored to their specific needs. Now, the article also mentioned something called challenging behaviors, and I feel like this is a big one for a lot of parents and caregivers, right? We're talking about things like those really intense tantrums, aggression towards others, even elopement, which for anyone who hasn't heard that term, it's basically when a child runs away, which obviously can be incredibly dangerous. So what's the ABA approach to those really, really tough situations?
You're right. Those situations can be incredibly stressful for everyone involved.
Mm.
And again, a lot of it goes back to that functional behavior assessment, the FBA, that we were talking about earlier.
So like we were discussing with the repetitive behaviors, it's about understanding the why.
Exactly. So with something like a tantrum, we need to figure out, okay, is this a way for the child to try and escape a demand? Are they having a meltdown because they're frustrated and don't know how to communicate their needs? Or is it something else entirely? Let's say a child has a tantrum every time they have to transition to a new activity. An FBA would help us figure out, is it sensory overload? Is it difficulty with transitions in general? Or is there another reason behind it?
So it's like detective work, in a way, to figure out what's driving that behavior and then find a healthier way for them to express those needs or cope with those challenges.
Exactly. You got it. Once we identify that function, then we can start teaching the child more appropriate ways to get what they need. Maybe it's using their words, maybe it's asking for a break, maybe it's engaging in a calming activity. It's all about giving them the tools they need to navigate those tough moments.
That makes so much sense. The article also briefly touched on cognitive and adaptive skills, which feel like these huge EE categories. What are some specific examples of where those challenges might show up, and how does ABA help support a child in those areas?
Think about the essential skills we need for, like, everyday life.
Mm.
Attention, memory, problem solving, self-care routines, social skills, things like that. These are all areas where ABA can make a real difference. For instance, a child who struggles with attention, they might benefit from things like visual timers and really clear, concise instructions to help them stay focused.
Oh, that's a good one. I use those with my kids sometimes, even.
Right. Or a child with memory challenges. They might thrive using visual aids and repetition to help solidify those memories. ABA really helps break those skills down into smaller, more manageable steps, making them a lot less overwhelming for the child to learn.
It's about finding those strategies that work for that particular child's learning style and their unique needs. Now, the article did a really good job of going beyond just listing the signs and actually delved into like the nitty-gritty of the ABA therapy process itself, which I think is super helpful for parents and caregivers who might be hearing about this for the first time. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what that journey actually looks like for families. Like, what's the first step usually?
So typically it all starts with a really thorough assessment to get a comprehensive look at the child's strengths, their challenges, the whole picture.
Right. And the article specifically mentioned functional behavior assessments. What exactly are those, and how do they fit into that bigger picture of the assessment process? It sounds like it's really about getting down to the nitty-gritty of those behaviors we were talking about, right? Like really understanding them on a deeper level.
Exactly. Think of it like we're putting those challenging behaviors under a microscope with an FBA. We're trying to figure out, okay, what makes this behavior tick?
I like that analogy, putting it under the microscope. So walk me through it. What does an FBA actually involve?
So it usually starts with a lot of observation, just watching the child in different settings, see what's going on in their environment. And then we talk to the parents, the caregivers, the teachers, anyone who interacts with the child regularly to get their perspectives. And then sometimes we might even make little tweaks to the environment on purpose, like just to see if we can figure out what those triggers are, what happens before the behavior occurs, and what happens afterward.
Oh, so you're really trying to pinpoint that cause and effect relationship.
You got it. Because the goal is to understand what's reinforcing that behavior so we can come up with a plan that actually works.
Yeah.
The article had a really good example about this, I thought. It talked about a child who kept, like, running away from the dinner table.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Elopement, right, they called it.
Yes. And it can be so scary for parents. But anyway, in that case, the FBA revealed that this child, they were super sensitive to the texture of certain foods. And the elopement, the running away, it was basically their way of trying to avoid those sensations, which, when you think about it, makes total sense.
Yeah, it's like their body was saying, nope, not happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But once the parents and the therapist understood that, they were able to start introducing new foods really gradually, and pairing them with things that the child already liked, and it made a huge difference. Mealtimes became so much more enjoyable for everyone.
It really goes to show sometimes it's those little adjustments that can make the biggest difference.
Totally. And that actually brings us to another really important piece of this puzzle, which the article highlighted as well, and that's the parents' role in all of this.
Yeah, it sounds like with ABA therapy, parents aren't just like on the sidelines, right? They're really involved in the process.
Absolutely. Parents are like their child's first and most important teachers,
Yeah.
They have so much valuable insight into their child's personality, their strengths, their challenges.
Mm.
So ABA therapists, we work really closely with parents to come up with strategies that can be used consistently, not just in therapy sessions, but at home, in the community, everywhere.
So it's about creating that like web of support around the child where everyone's on the same page.
Yes, exactly. It's about empowering parents to feel confident and equipped to support their child's growth in every aspect of their lives.
That's amazing. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something we mentioned earlier, just as a reminder to our listeners. We've been talking about all these early signs, but they're just that, right? Signs.
Right, they're not a diagnosis.
Exactly. And this article, it's packed with so much great information, but it's not meant to be a substitute for like a professional evaluation.
100%. So if you're noticing some of these signs in your child and you're feeling concerned, the most important thing is to talk to your pediatrician or another qualified professional who can do a proper assessment and figure out the best next steps for your family.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, this deep dive has been so eye-opening. It's not about rushing to judgment or like freaking out if our kids aren't hitting every single milestone exactly when the books say they should. It's about arming ourselves with knowledge, paying attention, trusting our gut, and having open conversations with those professionals who can guide us along the way.
Well said.
And remember, every child is different, every family is different, and there are so many resources and support systems out there. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or you just need someone to talk to, please reach out. You are not alone on this journey. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.